The third race of the season will be held in Australia, Albert Park. Now, the first two races of the season they were a bit lackluster because much was expected before the season began. But as the season is panning out, it does appear that we are heading towards a season where we might see Red Bull domination at the front of the grid. The first two races have seen Red Bull secure a 1-2 finish in both of them. The first race had Max Verstappen winning the race, while the second race had Sergio Perez picking up his first win of the season. Now, the aim of this video is sharing the preview and predictions for the Australian Grand Prix. Basically, the video will be divided into four parts where we'll cover first the key talking points, then we'll take a look at the pecking order after the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, then we'll take a look at the drivers and the teams that might be under pressure, and finally, I'll share my predictions. So, without further ado, let's begin. Now, the first key talking point is tension at Red Bull. Now, much has been said about a possible rivalry between Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez. Right now, after two races, we have both of them separated by just 1 point. Now, at least in my view, I honestly don't think there's much of a competition between the two, and if it wasn't for the reliability issue that hindered Max, there is going to be much of a battle that we'll see. Having said that, it is still going to be interesting because if in this race we see Verstappen once again suffering from some kind of reliability issue, then the season could turn. You could see tensions rise even more because Verstappen is not going to take another reliability issue in his car lying down. He won't accept it and he will speak out even more against Red Bull. So yeah, it will be interesting to see if there is any tension at Red Bull if something happens, or even if Sergio Perez is actually competitive against Verstappen this time around. Now the second point is how far will the chasing pack be at Australia? Now at the first race in Bahrain, we saw that Ferrari was around 6 to 7 tenths behind Red Bull in the race trim, and in qualifying the gap wasn't much. It was around 2 tenths that Leclerc had when he did his fastest lap in qualifying. However, when we moved to Saudi Arabia, we saw the gap increase. It was around 1 to 1.2 seconds between Red Bull and Aston Martin and the other teams in the chasing pack, including Mercedes and Ferrari. So it will be interesting to see if that kind of gap stays here. If we are looking at a gap of 1 to 1.2 seconds, then it will be tough to see any team overhaul that gap over the course of the season because at the end of the day, the gap is too big. And even if Red Bull is constrained by the restrictions in development time, there is still a huge gap that the team has already developed, and it will take a lot for that to be overhauled. That's why I think it will be interesting to see what kind of gap Red Bull has over the chasing pack, because if the gap is still that big, then we can probably call time on this season and ultimately see Red Bull dominate the entire 23 races. Now the next point is the impact of the 4 DRS zones. Now last season we had 3 DRS zones, and it was only in that curve that we have after the first sector where the DRS zone was not present. Daniel Ricciardo also talked about it and he said that the DRS zone might have helped. So this time around we are going to see that, and I'm not entirely sure how much of an impact the DRS zone will have because the braking zone is not there, and even though we see quite a few overtakes in that particular region, I'm not sure at the end of the day how much of an impact it will have in the overall racing. Last race, the race was not that much fun because it was quite straightforward. We had too many DRS packs and overtakes were not really viable. So let's see what kind of impact the 4 DRS zone has this time around. Now at number 4 we have can McLaren score points. Now much has been said about how poor McLaren's season start is. And there's hardly any denying. And it was almost comical when Oscar Piastri's front wing got damaged on the first lap and the debris damaged the front wing of Lando Norris. Now when something like this happens, you know that fate is not on your side. Having said that, if we look at the qualifying performance in both the races, we had Oscar Piastri reaching Q3 in Jeddah, which was a very impressive performance. And then in Bahrain, we had Lando Norris qualifying P11. Now, when you are putting in these kinds of qualifying positions, It does show that either the inherent pace is there, or there might be an opportunity for the two drivers to ultimately extract something that helps them be competitive. Now, at a track like Melbourne, where overtakes are tougher, to be honest, on a track like this, maybe a better qualifying position from either of the two drivers can help the team score points. It will be worth keeping an eye on McLaren and how it fares over the weekend. Now in number 5, Red Bull's DRS advantage. Now much has been said about it. It started with Lewis Hamilton claiming that he had never seen a car this fast. Then we had Ted Kravitz backing it up and specifying what Lewis was talking about. I've even seen a video from Autosport where this was mentioned. But if you ask me, even I've done a video, I've looked at the data. I don't see any factual proof of what has been claimed by Autosport, Ted Kravitz, and even Lewis as well. So I'm not sure what kind of DRS advantage they are talking about. But yes, it will be interesting to see if that kind of thing still sustains this weekend. Now, next, let's take a look at the pecking order after the first two races of the season. Now, I've divided the entire pecking order in groups of 4 based on their performance. Now, in group 1, I have Red Bull. Now, I don't think anyone is even close to Red Bull to even be put in the same group. And because the relative performance, there's no team that comes close to it. In group 2, I have a combination of Ferrari, Mercedes, and Aston Martin. In the first race, we had Ferrari being the second fastest car. At least in my view, it was the second fastest car, although some claim that Aston Martin was. In the second race, it was much clearer that Aston Martin was the second fastest. So, in my view, these three teams are in that bunch. They are pretty much interchangeable because Mercedes also showed podium challenging pace in Jeddah. So, maybe they might even improve. So, in Group 2, I have these three teams: Ferrari, Aston Martin, and Mercedes. It it is pretty much interchangeable how you want to put them. Then in group 3 I have Alpine, Haas and McLaren. Now the reason why I've put these three teams together is because okay, in terms of race pace it does appear that Alpine is closer to the top 4 than to the bottom 5. However, in terms of qualifying, it does appear that the car is still not good enough in qualifying, and that was arguably one of the reasons why Pierre Gasly was outqualified by Oscar Piastri in the second race. Now, this is something that needs to be worked on for sure, but at least for now, in terms of the vicinity of the pace that these teams have shown, we've seen Haas score a Q3, we've seen Alpine score Q3 with Ocon in both occasions, and then we've seen McLaren do that as well. So, in terms of that single lap pace, something that's going to be very important in Australia, I think these three form the group behind the top runners. And yes, maybe Alpine might stretch its legs in the race, but in terms of qualifying, arguably the more important part of the weekend, I think it's going to be very close. Then in the last group, I have Alfa Romeo, Williams, and Alfa Tauri. Now, Alfa Romeo does show strong race pace. It has shown that in both the races, but the qualifying is just not there, and Bottas struggled like anything. So, yeah, at least for now, I'm keeping Alfa Romeo, Williams, and Alfa Tauri in the last group. Now, let's talk about who is under pressure heading into the Australian Grand Prix. Now, when we talk about the team which is under pressure, I think it has to be Ferrari. The team was second fastest in Bahrain, and the gap to Red Bull was around 6 to 7 tenths. However, as we move to Saudi Arabia, a track that was supposed to ultimately benefit Ferrari, it didn't do that. It had the opposite effect, and we saw Ferrari get pushed back into P3 and P4. Now, when that happens, it's not only demoralizing, it also raises questions, and the questions are being raised of Ferrari. So, how will they answer these questions? Will the team be able to bounce back and be the second fastest car once again at Australia? I think these are the questions that need to be answered, and if that does not happen, there are going to be even more questions raised against Fred Vasseur because at the end of the day, he's the team principal. Even though he has joined just this season, he needs to answer these questions. So yeah, let's see what happens with them. Now talking about the drivers, it does appear that Nick De Vries is under pressure. One of the major reasons why Nick is under pressure is because, to be honest, much was said about him, and arguably he was overhyped in my view. He didn't need to be put under that kind of a spotlight because I agree he's 28 and he's raced with George Russell, Leclerc, Albon, and Norris, but at the end of the day, he was beaten by all of them. He's impressive, but he's not as impressive as some made him out to be. As a result, expectations were far too high, and he's pretty much getting beaten by Yuki Tsunoda quite easily. So, at least in my view, I think he will be under pressure because even Helmut Marko has mentioned that De Vries needs to perform better than how he's doing right now. Now, finally, the part of the video that I love the most, predictions. Now, the first prediction is that, well, Max Verstappen is going to win the race. It's a pretty straightforward prediction because at the end of the day, Red Bull is just too dominant. Even if the teams close the gap, I don't see any of the teams challenging Red Bull so early in the season. I don't think that's going to happen. Then, if we talk about the rivalry with Sergio Perez, let's be fair. There is no rivalry. Max Verstappen has been a more dominant teammate, and he has been there since the last 2 seasons. So expecting Max to lose to Sergio Perez, something that he's not done quite often in the last 2 seasons, is it's a bit of a stretch. So I'm not going to take that bet. For me, at least for now, I think Max Verstappen is going to win the race in Australia. Arguably, Sergio Perez will be second, but the gap will be pronounced. Now, the second prediction is I expect Charles Leclerc to finish on the podium. In the eyes of many, Ferrari has taken a step back. I agree, they have. Although my theory is somewhat different. I feel that Ferrari turned down its engine at Saudi Arabia after what happened in the first race and after how Charles Leclerc had to contend with the ECU issues that plagued him in basically both the races. Ferrari probably turned down the engine to a more safer value so that maybe the team could gather more data and finish the race. Now, what we've seen in the first 2 races as well as during the preseason test is that the Ferrari engine, it does not have too many issues, to be fair. The works team itself has faced a few issues. It has already changed an engine. But if you take a look at the customer teams, be it Haas or Alfa Romeo, both teams have not faced an issue. There's no DNF, there's no issue or anything. So maybe Ferrari was playing it safe at Jeddah, and now with one race under the belt and more confidence, the team can start pushing the power unit once again. Now, when it did push the power unit in Bahrain, Leclerc was only 2 tenths behind Max Verstappen and around 6 to 7 tenths behind in the race. If he's able to maintain that kind of performance at Australia, he will finish on the podium. A P3 is what I expect, nothing more than that, because I don't expect anyone to really challenge the Red Bull boys. Now, my third prediction is I expect McLaren to score points this weekend. Much has been said about McLaren being the worst car on the grid. I don't think that is the case. I think the car is bad, but at the end of the day, from P6 to P10, there's hardly anything to choose. And then with the kind of drivers that McLaren has, both Norris and Oscar Piastri, they are impressive, very, very impressive. And arguably one of the more, you can say, a driver lineup bubbling with talent. That's the kind of lineup that they have. Now at Bahrain and even in Jeddah, the drivers were able to qualify closer to P10. So they were closer to the point scoring finishes when they started the race. The problem is they encountered reliability issues or they had an incident. Now, at least now in Australia, if either of those things doesn't happen, then there is a very strong possibility that they will score points. Why? Because if they're able to qualify at P9, P10, P11, something like this, and have a cleaner race, then I don't really see a point where the team could struggle to score points. McLaren is not that bad operationally, and the team knows how to score points. It has done that for the last 2 3 years. So yeah, I am backing the Woking based squad to score its first points this season. Now my fifth prediction is that I am predicting a surprise point scorer. Now when I'm saying that, I mean that we will see someone who we did not expect to score points come race day. Someone who is probably qualifying closer to P20 than P10. I'm expecting I'm expecting one of the drivers to do something similar to what Alexander Albon did last season. He scored points by going on a long single stop strategy and then pitting on the last lap to ultimately do his mandatory pit stop. The tires, they tend to last on this kind of track, and overtaking is a bit of an issue as well. So yeah, I'm predicting one surprise point scorer this weekend. Now this concludes the preview and predictions for the 2023 Formula 1 Australian Grand Prix. I hope you guys liked the video. Please like, share and subscribe. Thanks for watching and see you next time.